Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 254. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have news on Ukraine, Afghanistan, and North Korea's latest intercontinental ballistic missile test. A lot of interesting stuff to talk about on today's show. Share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and right now at the Institute, we are holding our spring fundraiser. So if you would like to support the work that we're doing at the Institute, Scott Horton, of course, set this up. Sheldon Richmond is a founding member. Myself and Keith Knight, Patrick McFarlane, Tommy Solomons, and a great group of writers, including Will Porter and Connor Freeman, who Connor's the co-host of the show. Will's a co-host of the show as well, but is currently writing with me as well at the Institute. So if you would like to support the work that we're doing, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Scott has a bunch of great kitbats lined up for everybody right now. All you got to do is donate a couple books and you'll get a digital copy of an Institute book. If you want to donate a little bit more, you could get a physical copy. You could get a Libertarian Institute mug and a really cool drawstring backpack. So a lot of great stuff that we're giving away at the Institute. Head on over, support what we're doing, and get yourself some cool Libertarian Institute swag and butts. Other places you can find the show, Twitter, @con_interest. My handle is @KyleAnslone_. There is a Facebook page for the show. You can subscribe for the video version on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. The show is also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. So Scott Horton's show, Liberty Weekly, Don't Tread on Anyone, Year Zero, and this show, Conflicts of Interest, all in one feed. If you'd like to, make sure you don't miss any of the great content that we're putting out there. And then if you'd like to donate directly to the show, Patreon, Subscribestar, and crypto information all in the show notes page, as well as the information for our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. When you spend $75 or more, you get 20% off and the show gets a kickback. It's a great way to help your favorite podcast and help yourself out. They have tons of high quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. If you're new, they have an education tab. If you already know what you want, they probably make it at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into the show, and we're going to start off today with Biden's 4-day trip to Europe that wrapped up yesterday, and he made the biggest headlines on Friday and Saturday in what are now being described as gaffes, but we'll break this all down. So on Friday, this written up by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. White House insists U.S. troops not going to Ukraine after Biden gaffe in Poland. On Friday, the White House said U.S. troops will not be going to Poland after President Biden addressed members of the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division in Poland and suggested that they might be entering the war zone. Biden told the troops that regular citizens in Ukraine were stepping up in the face of the Russian assault, and you're going to see when you're there, and some of you have been there, you're going to see women, young people standing in the middle in front of a damn tank just saying, "I'm not leaving, I'm holding my ground," he said. And so, it really sounds like what he's telling these soldiers is that you're going to go and see what Ukraine is like, and that would mean deploying them to a war zone where Russian forces are. Now, when asked if U.S. troops would be deployed to the Ukraine, the White House told Fox News that Biden's position has not changed. The president has been clear, we are not sending U.S. troops, and there is no change in that position, the White House said. Biden has said repeatedly that he has no plans to send U.S. troops into Ukraine to fight Russia, and that he has acknowledged that direct fighting with Moscow means World War III. And so this is one of the points on the show where I have really praised Biden through all of this. Now, there were a bunch of off ramps that this guy missed. But he has been pretty clear that the United States will not engage in direct military confrontation with Russia, especially in Ukraine. And that is really important because there are a lot of hawks in DC who would very much like that to happen. And the president drawing a hard line on that is very important. However, this seems to suggest that at least somewhere in Biden's mind, there is a possibility that U.S. troops could be traveling to Ukraine. Now, as when I read the statement, it is a little bit of a mess, and maybe he wasn't saying what he said. He was maybe trying to say that you'll see once the refugees get to Poland or something like that, but they already been arriving. So it's very hard to see another way where this wasn't as it sounds, which is Biden telling the troops that they are very soon going to be entering Poland. Now, the White House wants that one back. But then on Saturday, we get this statement that sounds an awful lot like Joe Biden calling for regime change. I wrote this yesterday for antiwar.com. Biden calls on Putin to be removed from power. White House wants that threat. President Joe Biden demanded Russian leader Vladimir Putin be removed from power during a speech in Poland over the weekend. The White House quickly issued a statement saying the president was not calling for regime change in Moscow. The president's latest verbal assault on Russia was made Saturday during Biden's 4-day trip to Europe. Standing in front of the royal castle in Warsaw, he said, "For God's sakes, this man," referring to Putin, "cannot remain in power." The statement appeared to be a call to remove Putin as president of the Russian Federation. Shortly after, the White House issued a statement claiming that that was not Biden's intent. Fox News reports an administration official said the Pentagon's point, or the administration official said the president's point was not that Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbors or the region. He was not discussing Putin's power in Russia or regime change. And, it's nice that they say this now, but it doesn't seem like that's really what Biden was saying at the time. So, in recent weeks, Biden has called Putin a murderous thug, dictator, war criminal. In that same speech, he also called him brutal. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the remarks have pushed Moscow and its relationship with Washington to the verge of breaking. The Kremlin appears less concerned about Biden's Saturday speech. When asked about the comment, Reuters spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, "This is not for Biden to decide. The president of Russia is elected by Russians." Now, there was also a statement made by the head of the Russian space agency who said that, this is President Alzheimer's just doing what he does. And I did then see yesterday, later last night, that there was a statement from a Russian official that was like, these statements are concerning and could harm the relationship. And the spokesperson did say that too. Personal insults like this narrow the window of opportunity for our bilateral relations under the current U.S. administration. It is necessary to be aware of this. And, I think that's a good point, but it didn't seem like this had drawn the same reaction as when Biden called Putin a war criminal last week. French President Emmanuel Macron echoed Moscow's concerns about Biden's statement. He said achieving a ceasefire was the first priority, and if we want to do that, we cannot escalate either in words or actions. And so, interesting how this all works out, where the one European state, maybe two, with Germany that seems most concerned about making sure this doesn't escalate is France. And here his president is saying like, hey, Russia's right about the rhetoric the regime, the American regime is using. Also yesterday, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was traveling to the Middle East and announced a new $100 million security package to Ukraine. I wrote this yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced a new $100 million military aid package to Ukraine on Sunday while visiting Israel. The latest security assistance includes armored vehicles for Ukrainian police and border guards. The U.S. labeled the donation, which also includes includes secure personal protection equipment, tactical and communications equipment, and medical supplies as civilian security assistant. With the government's vital assistance, Ukrainian law enforcement officers are playing a key role in rescuing victims of the Russian brutal assault, leading and protecting convoys of those displaced by attacks, and providing security to civilian areas war-torn apart by ruthless and devastating bombing, Blinken said. While the U.S. highlights the equipment's potential civilian use, the communication devices and armored vehicles could be deployed in combat. The Ukrainian government has touted its ability to militarize its civilian population. The U.S. did not say that the police forces would be vetted before receiving the equipment. One potential concern would be the white supremacist C-14 gang. The group created a municipal guard that patrols the streets of Kiev, and as Mats Blumenthal and Alexander Rubinstein explained in a recent article, they do somewhat act as the police force of that city. You also have a similar situation, at least prior to the war in Mariupol, where the city's police force and security force was largely, I don't know about largely, at least in some part, was populated by the neo-Nazi Azov battalion. And so if you're giving weapons to these, or armored vehicles, essentially weapons to these people, that is very concerning. Now, again, we don't know exactly where this is going, and I'm sure that armored vehicles in war zones can have uses for transporting civilians in dangerous situations. Secure communications equipment could have the same role. At the same time, these vehicles can be used to carry out attacks against Russian forces, and that's really important to remember, that I think Russia is going to look at it in the second way. Also, they also tack on that, hey, we're sending medicine here, and so if they're sending $90 million in medicine and $10 million in other stuff, that's absolutely great, but my guess is that that number is maybe $1 million or so in medicine, and it's mostly going to be made up of the equipment that could also be used offensively against Russia. Back to the article, Blinken revealed the aid package in Israel. He arranged a conference in the Israeli desert that included some of America's Arab allies. While the Iran deal was a central subject of the meeting, the New York Times reports Ukraine was foremost on Blinken's mind. America's top diplomat said Ukraine was very much a part of the conversation. Many states in the Middle East have declined to sanction Russia. Tel Aviv is playing a key role in negotiations between Kiev and Moscow. Blinken noted Israel's diplomatic role and praised the humanitarian assistance as donated to Kiev. However, he made it clear that he was still seeking more from Washington's Mideast partners. We will be talking throughout about various means of support that Israel and other countries can give to Ukraine, said Blinken. And look, there every reason to help, the people who are suffering from Putin's war. However, if you're looking at the state of Israel, if they really want to give money to refugees, maybe they should give it to the Palestinian refugees that they create with their apartheid state. Also, if the U.S. Really is concerned about bringing an end to the conflict in Ukraine, which I'm not so sure about. I think Biden's statements over the weekend, a lot of things that we talked about in the show in the past, made me very skeptical that that is the U.S. goal. But if that really was the U.S. goal, then it does seem to me that the U.S. shouldn't be pressuring Israel to take any side in this conflict and only to be involved in the mediation, because it's one of the few states that has had interest and has a relationship with both Moscow and Kiev. On Sunday, the Secretary of State also reiterated Joe Biden was not calling for regime change in Moscow when he said, for God's sakes, this man Putin cannot remain in power. However, the proposal to remove Vladimir Putin did find some support in Washington. Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., which, remember, she was seated next to Jill Biden during the State of the Union and received a pretty unanimous standing ovation from the entire congressional and, American elite parlor. She said, we clearly understand in Ukraine that anyone who is a war criminal, who attacks a neighboring country, who is doing all these atrocities together with the Russians that are involved, cannot stay in power in a civilized world. I have one more story here about the situation in Ukraine, and then I'll get into diplomacy and stuff like that next. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute yesterday. Ukrainian military intelligence chief threatens total guerrilla warfare. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence threatened total guerrilla warfare in Russian-occupied territory. He also warned Moscow that was attempting to split his country into a divided state. The military chief said that Ukraine was preparing a guerrilla war in the territory that Russia continues to control. He said the season of total Ukrainian guerrilla safari will soon begin. The statement came from the intel chief, comes as the United States is dumping billions of insurgency-style weapons into Ukraine. The American weapons shipments to Kiev include shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles that the CIA provided to the Afghan Mujahideen to use against the Soviet army. There's a long track record of influential foreign policy thinkers who suggested that America would benefit from Russia fighting an insurgency in Ukraine. The latest official to express the benefits of the Ukrainian insurgency is U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl. He believes Russia would be weakened by a war in Ukraine. He said, I think with a high degree of certainty that Russia will emerge from Ukraine weaker than it went into the conflict, militarily weaker, economically weaker, politically and geopolitically weaker, and more isolated. The CIA has also spent several years training Ukrainians in insurgency tactics. The agency believes those it trained would be used as the leaders of the resistance if Russia invaded. The Ukrainian military intel chief also accused Russia of trying to create a Korean split of Ukraine. In fact, he said it is an attempt to create North and South Korea in Ukraine. Russia has demanded that Kiev recognize Moscow's control over Crimea and the independence of the Donbass before it would end its assault. On Sunday, Zelensky indicated for the first time that he may be willing to compromise with Russia over control of the Donbass. The two Donbass republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, have been at war with Kiev since 2014. So now let's get into thoughts on potential territory and everything like that. Initially, I had wrote this article for antiwar.com, focused all on a statement that Zelensky made on a 90-minute call with Russian media, saying that he was willing to compromise on the Donbass region. He didn't directly walk that back later in the day, but he did give a contradictory statement. So the title of this article, published yesterday at antiwar.com by myself, Zelensky sends mixed messages about Ukraine's willingness to compromise. I write, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country was willing to compromise over the country's Donbass region. A core Russian demand has been that Ukraine give up its territorial claim to the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. However, Zelensky appeared to contradict himself, saying he would prioritize the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The earlier statement from Zelensky was the first time he signaled a willingness to negotiate about giving up territory. Last week, he told CNN, there are compromises for which we cannot be ready as an independent state, any compromise related to our territorial integrity and sovereignty. His later statement is more in line with the posture he took on CNN. The mixed messages come before planned talks with Russia and Turkey. Moscow demands that Ukraine recognize the Crimean Peninsula as Russian territory and the independence of the Donbass republics. President Joe Biden was asked about the Russian demand on Thursday. Biden said he did not think Kiev would have to take that step, but it was up to Ukraine. Zelensky stated his openness to compromise on a 90-minute call with Russian media. He also restated his offer to declare neutrality if Ukraine gets security promises. Security guarantees and neutrality, non-nuclear status of our state. We are ready to go for it. This is the most important point. If Zelensky is serious about ceding territory, it's unclear if Russia would agree to a proposal that would have a third party, likely the US and its NATO allies, treaty bound to go to war in Ukraine, or how Kiev plans to get another country to commit to its defense. Another factor is Ukraine's inability to control the Donbass. Since war broke out in 2014, the governments in Luhansk and Donetsk have been outside of Kiev's authority and often relied on Russia for support. Last week, Russia announced a new phase in its special military operation. It said it would focus on securing the Donbass. The head of the Luhansk government believes a vote about joining Russia will happen soon. I think that in the near future, a referendum will be held on the territory of the Republic during which the people express their opinion on joining the Russian Federation, he said. So, that is, what I have on Zelensky's mixed messages there. It's not exactly, I think, clear if Ukraine is willing to compromise on this point or not. Zelensky is an actor, and so I always, do consider that maybe he really does play to his audience, and seeing that this was Russian media, he was trying to sound more conciliatory than the position he's actually willing to take is, and later in the day he gave his real position. However, if he was serious about being willing to compromise on the Donbass with the other things that Ukraine has been willing to talk about, I do think that there's a possibility we are getting closer to an agreement. All right, now on to what the U.S. is doing to try to isolate Russia. This from Dave DeCamp, March 25th at antiwar.com. U.S. EU strike natural gas deal to undercut Russian energy. The U.S. and EU on Friday said they reached a natural gas deal as part of an effort to reduce Europe's reliance on Russian energy. The EU currently relies on Russia for about 40% of its natural gas, but is looking to stop all energy imports from Moscow by 2027 as a part of the US-led effort to hurt the Russian economy. Under the deal, the US will work with allies to deliver the EU 15 billion in cubic meters of liquefied natural gas (LNG) this year. It is not clear how much will be exported by the US and how much will come from other countries. A Biden administration official said the US nearly doubled its LNG exports to Europe over the past 3 months. Germany, one of the countries most reliant on Russian energy, announced a plan on Friday to have its imports of Russian oil by the summer. Before Russia launched its attack on Ukraine, Germany imported 55% of its gas and 45% of its coal and about a third of its oil from Russia. So that is the U.S. plan. Not sure if it's going to work out, but they are discussing that. And then one last article here from Dave DeCamp, and this is something I think we're going to see more and more of as the Hots exploit the war in Ukraine. Dave titles this article, U.S. Canada looking to bolster their forces in the Arctic. While Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put more Western forces in Eastern Europe, the U.S. and Canada are also looking to bolster their forces in their north. AFP reported on Wednesday that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted Canada to scramble to bolster its military in the Arctic, what the country's top general calls NATO's northern flank. As we're taking a look at what's happening in Ukraine, we're also having a very close look at what else Russia is doing in the world, and their far north is a key area of concern, the head of Canada's defense staff said. The U.S. and Canada concluded the U.S.-led Arctic Edge military exercises that are held in Alaska. During the drills, the U.S. deployed Patriot missiles and other advanced air systems in Alaska for the first time. According to Defense Post, the U.S. used Patriots as well as Avenger short-range air defense system and the AN/MPQ-64 Sentinel radar. A National Guard commander said that deploying the systems to Alaska sends a clear message to the U.S.'s adversaries. In recent years, the U.S. military has identified the Arctic as a potential future battlefield for wars against Russia and China. Last year, the U.S. Army released a policy document that said the Arctic has the potential to become a contested space where the U.S. Great power rivals Russia and China seek to use the military and economic powers to gain military access to the region at the expense of U.S. interest. Dave concludes, the U.S. military released a similar strategy document in early 2021. Then Navy Secretary Kenneth Braithwaite suggested that the U.S. could start challenging Russian claims to the Arctic by sending warships near Russia's northern coast, similar to how the U.S. Navy makes provocative passages near Chinese-controlled islands in the South China Sea. So that is the updates I have for Ukraine. Of course, the situation in Ukraine is still bad, and later in the week I will do a more detailed breakdown about where the Russians are advancing and things like that, what's happening in the various cities, where the estimated death counts and stuff like that. But now I want to move on and talk about Afghanistan. The first story I have here is an article that I wrote with Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, and we titled this one, Infant Mortality Spikes in Afghanistan as Officials Say 13,000 plus newborns have died since January. The Afghan government has estimated more than 13,000 newborns have died in the country so far this year, just 6 months after the U.S. withdrew humanitarian aid, seized official bank accounts, and sanctioned the new regime in Kabul. Health Minister spokesman Gerard Hazher expressed alarm over the growing crisis last week, saying that there have been about 124,800 premature births in Afghanistan since the beginning of 2022 alone. Normally, 10% of these children die, so as an estimate, 13,700 of these children have died since January, and that is the number from the Afghan health ministry. Now, this health ministry is run by the Taliban, and they are making an estimate here. This is a country where, as we'll get into in a second, the humanitarian catastrophe is enormous and absolutely terrible. And so the fact that they don't have a extremely accurate count on the number of women who are giving birth to babies who end up dying within a year or two is not surprising, or I guess a month or two in this case. They're talking about just the newborns. They're not even talking about the children under 5 at this point. It's possible that the numbers they're using for whatever reason, they say normally it's 10% of these children die. Well, maybe the increase in the number of women who are giving birth early, for however that dynamic works, is leading to, a slightly lower percentage of those children to die. But hell, even if it's 5% or 3% or something like that, we're still talking about 1,000 plus children, Afghan children, a month dying because largely the U.S. sanctions campaign on Russia. So I just kind of want to break it down because it is an estimate, and it could turn out to be lower, like famously, Madeleine Albright said 500,000 dead Iraqi children are worth it. And that study had inflated quite a bit the number of Iraqi children that died from 300,000 to 500,000. And so, it's almost half, but at the same time, 300,000 is just as awful. If nobody had ever said 500,000, 300,000 would make you feel just as sick as when you thought it was 500,000, because it's just statistics, and the number of ruined lives from children starving to death in the hundreds of thousands is just really unimaginable how horrific that is. So back to the article. While the health ministry said economic factors such as malnutrition are driving the surge in death among mothers and babies, poor diets may not explain everything. Malalia Ramali, who heads up a maternity hospital in Kabul, told Tolo News that health facilities have struggled to get the required equipment and medical staff, noting that midwives and doctors aren't available in every district, and have some provinces even lack a modern hospital. And so this is one of the things that happened after the US withdrew its aid and froze all the Afghan government accounts. All the nurses and doctors stopped getting paid. This was a major issue months ago. And look, maybe if you're a doctor or a nurse or something like that, and you can't, that if you don't go to work, that nobody's going to go to work. And so you continue to go to work and everything. Like, you could do that for a couple months maybe, but at some point maybe feeding your own family has to come first, and you had to leave your job at the hospital that you're not getting paid for to go do something that finds some kind of food for your family. So though the latest estimate on infant mortality comes from the Taliban health ministry, international aid groups have painted a similarly dire picture for Afghanistan, some warning the collapse of this healthcare system for months. In November, Doctors Without Borders described a worrying increase in the rate of malnutrition across southwestern Afghanistan, citing the suspension of international aid following the Taliban seizure of power last year. WHO Director General has also predicted an imminent humanitarian catastrophe unless urgent action is taken. Deputy Special Representative for the Secretary General of the UN described the current crisis as staggering and almost inconceivable, saying up to 95% of Afghans are not eating enough food, and that percentage rises almost to 100% for female-headed households. And if you think about Afghanistan, a country that the U.S. has relentlessly bombed for the past 20 years, we've enlisted tens of thousands of Afghan men into the Afghan National Army, which, folded and collapsed. But before that, 40,000 of them had died over the past couple of years. There's got to be a staggering number of these female-headed households where all of them are not getting enough food. He continued, hospital wards are filled with children suffering from malnutrition, smaller than they should be, many weighing at a year what an infant of 6 months would weigh in a developed country, and some so weak that they are unable to move. That means that these children here he's looking at are about to die of starvation because of what the U.S. is doing to Afghanistan. UN Emergency Aid Coordinator Margaret Griffith has attributed the crisis in part to international sanctions and the seizure of the government bank accounts. The Joe Biden administration has spearheaded those policies, recently declaring that it would not return $7 billion in frozen funds, though it did claim it would use some of the money for aid. While the U.S. has loosened some sanctions and allowed aid to enter the country, restrictions on banking continues to pose a massive obstacle for humanitarian orders, as Afghan's financial sector remains barely functional. We conclude with this from Human Rights Watch. Aid groups delivering humanitarian assistance say they are unable to move funds into Afghanistan because international banks remain wary of pre-existing sanctions on the Taliban, and that payments to Afghanistan are routinely blocked by banks wary of running afoul of sanctions. And so it is the U.S. actions that are creating this situation in Afghanistan. Now, if you didn't hear about the 13,000 deaths, and look, I do understand that the source here is the Taliban, but if you look at what the other aid groups are saying, in Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, the UN, which tends, if anything, is like, the Taliban aren't even members of the United. There's no, Afghan seat at the United Nations for the Taliban government of Afghanistan, and yet, these are statements coming from the UN about how serious this is and how the US sanctions are responsible for this. But yet, if you look at the US media, there's nothing on the humanitarian crisis caused by the US sanctions. There's nothing about these children being starved to death. However, there is so much focus on the claims here that are not the claims that the Taliban are not allowing young girls, high school girls, to return to school, which is wrong, right? It's a setback for their society. Obviously, with I'm sure the high number of males in the society that have been killed by the American war over the past 20 years, females are going to have to take a very large role, and likely are going to be needed to help out in the workforce. I think that's something else I have talked about like teacher shortages and things like that. If you don't allow the women to teach, then you're losing like your potential employment base. This is absolutely crazy what the Taliban are doing with this. However, from the American perspective, we cannot force the Taliban to allow high school girls to go to school. It would be great if there was something that we could do short of starving children to death and bombing Afghanistan. Maybe if like the US was removing sanctions from Afghanistan, but also telling these aid groups like, hey, like really talk to the Taliban about, you would like to see females in positions of power if you're going to be bringing aid and donating things to Afghanistan. There may be ways like that the U.S. could kind of try to nudge this in the right direction. But putting sanctions on Afghanistan is only killing people. Bombing is only killing people. There's nothing really the U.S. can do to force the Taliban to allow girls to go to school, or at least not at a massive cost that just simply isn't worth it, like launching a 20-year war or crippling sanctions and destroying the entire Afghan economy. And as we saw, both of those things really didn't move the needle all that. The sanctions don't do anything. The Taliban are continuing not to allow girls to go to school despite the sanctions. And even with the U.S. military occupation, the 20-year war, the constant bombing of Afghanistan, there were tons of girls that still didn't receive educations and things like that. Now, there were obviously counterexamples where women were able to rise to far more prominent positions in Afghanistan because of the system the U.S. had set up. However, as Anand Gopal pointed out in his article, The Other Afghan Women, 70% of the women really weren't subject to any of the benefits of the U.S. occupation and actually suffer more than they would have under the Taliban because of the, U.S. warfare and the way the U.S. handled things. All right. So anyways, from an American's perspective, I really think our media should be focusing on the sanctions and things like that, what we can pressure our government to actually do for the people of Afghanistan is lift sanctions. Unfortunately, we can't do anything about the girls going to school. So anyways, here me and Will had a follow-up article at the Libertarian Institute the next day. Biden breaks off talks with Afghanistan government despite raging hunger crisis. The White House has canceled meetings with the Taliban over its refusal to allow young girls to attend high school, scrapping talks intended to address Afghanistan's crumbling economy and looming humanitarian catastrophe. A State Department official confirmed the move on Friday, telling Reuters that Washington called off talks set for Qatar over the weekend after the Taliban-led government made a deeply disappointing and inexplicable reversal of its commitments to the Afghan people. We have canceled some of our engagements, including planned meetings in Doha, and made clear that we see this decision as a potential turning point in our engagement, the unnamed official said. On Wednesday, Kabul reversed a previous pledge to open up high schools to Afghan girls, with the country's education ministry stating that the idea would be placed on hold until further notice when a comprehensive plan in accordance with the Sharia and Afghan culture is developed. The cancellation of the means in dollars could have dire consequences for Afghanistan, however, which is in the grips of a massive economic and hunger crisis as millions sit on the brink of starvation. The delegations were set to discuss a number of related issues, including ongoing restrictions on the country's central bank, as well as a humanitarian exchange facility to set up free cash and hundreds of millions of dollars of funding currently in a World Bank trust fund, according to three sources cited by Reuters. Representatives from the World Bank and United Nations had also planned to attend. Afghanistan's economic woes have been caused in no small part by international sanctions and penalties on the Taliban, creating major roadblocks for aid funds as banks are unwilling or unable to process transactions into the country. The Joe Biden administration, moreover, sees more than $9 billion in Afghan central bank reserves held overseas following the Taliban's return to power last summer, declaring that it would simply keep half the funds and redistribute them to the victims of the 9/11 attacks. The other half would be generously spent on aid for, and we write that kind of, tongue-in-cheek, for the impoverished Afghans, though it's unclear when that money will be released. Of course, this was the Afghan zone money that we're now returning to them and calling it aid. As the Kabul government reports a surge in infant mortality, UN officials have estimated that up to 95% of Afghans are not eating enough food, with that figure, again, as I point out, raising to 100% for the female-headed households. As of December, at least 1 million Afghan children under the age of 5 were at risk of dying due to severe acute malnutrition, according to UNICEF, which cited freezing of donor aid as among the major factors driving the crisis. The implosion of the Afghan economy comes despite 20 years of nation-building efforts by the U.S. and a number of allies, which collapsed in a matter of days after the Taliban rolled into Kabul in August. Though hundreds of billions were spent propping up the government and some businesses, it appears to have had little lasting effect, as up to 75% of the Afghan economy remains based on outside funding, according to David Beasley, who heads up the UN's World Food Program. The international community the last 20 or 30 years has done a disastrous job here, Beasley said to the New Yorker in January, calling for the immediate release of urgently needed aid funds. If you unfreeze the money, then you can put liquidity back in the marketplace and the economy will start to come back up. If you don't, there is going to be a need to feed 22 to 33 million people per month. We are going to need to be feeding 35 million people. This country will absolutely collapse. Dire and disturbing warnings that we're getting here about what the future looks like for Afghanistan. Now, I do want to take just a second here to mention there is a trend that I'm seeing mostly in the U.S. mainstream media, but kind of in general, pointing out that, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is going to cause food shortages. And that may be the case, that there are some food shortages that are created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It may, exacerbate some of these systems that are already in place. But if the U.S. really doesn't care about this, it creates food shortages all over the world, intentionally so. This is the Biden's Deputy Iran envoy, Richard Nephew, also worked in coordinated sanctions for the Obama administration as a U.S. government official. In between the two administrations, when he worked for the U.S. government, he wrote a book where he deliberately said the U.S. was attempting to raise the price of food for the people of Iran and Russia, and lamented that the price of chicken hadn't raised more when I think he went to Moscow or something like that. The intentional point of these programs is so the average person in these countries cannot afford to have enough to eat and enough to feed their children. That's the explicit purpose of these sanctions, and it's so disgusting. And then anytime that another country does anything that will at all cause this same kind of situation, well, then we freak out about it and say, well, that's just the most awful Hitlerian thing that Putin is doing. All right. Let's move on. One last thing on Afghanistan. There's a very good article out in ProPublica about the 1,200 Afghan children who came to the U.S. who didn't have a parent, guardian, or any kind of family member to take them in. About 200 of them remain in group homes, and so as somebody, I've never actually worked in a group home, but I have worked in a therapy school, and I have worked, with adults with more serious mental health disorders. I'm not surprised at all by what these people are dealing with, but the conditions are absolutely horrific. It sounds like sexual abuse between the children. You have instances of self harm, running away, suicide attempts, violence directed towards each other, staff themselves. It's just it sounds awful. You could go through and read the whole ProPublica article yourself if you like, but it's not necessarily that, I bring this up to say that the U.S. is doing a particularly bad job here. I don't think there's a way to do a good job with this. And it's one of the reasons that you don't start wars in the first place, is because when you do, you create these kind of children who are so traumatized, and there's some trauma that there's not a solution for. And that trauma is then going to present itself in very destructive ways, at least for the person, substance abuse, self-harm, suicide, depression, things like that, or, for society at large when, these people, potentially, start to act out on their violent impulses and hurt other people. So I'm not like, saying that these children are awful or anything like that. That's not necessarily my point. It's just, this is a consequence of war, is traumatized children who grow into traumatized adults who do what people with heavy trauma past sometimes do, which is hurt themselves and others. And so it's a tragedy, and why the U.S. shouldn't have spent the past 20 years bombing Afghanistan. Now I want to move on and talk about Korea, where I haven't talked very much about North Korea in 2022, but North Korea has been attempting to generate some headlines. They've carried out 10 missile tests so far this year, 7 alone in January, a variety of different missile types. They rail-fired cruise missile, a couple ballistic missiles, what they say were a spy satellite. One test rocket actually exploded just after takeoff, and the most recent test was of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And we write this, myself and Will Porter, for the Libertarian Institute on March 24th. North Korea tests first ICBM since 2017. In this article, we kind of get into how the U.S. mainstream media reported this incorrectly and why that's important. North Korea has tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, for the first time in 5 years. While Western governments and media have claimed the move violated a missile test moratorium, Pyongyang announced an end to that policy more than 2 years ago. North Korea confirmed Thursday's test in a statement, saying the missile was a new variant of its Hwasong-17 ICBM, and that the launch was meant to prepare for confrontation with U.S. imperialists. According to Japanese officials, the missile flew for 71 minutes, a distance of 680 miles, and reached a maximum altitude of more than 3,725 miles, height and flight time significantly greater than the North Korea's last ICBM test. Some analysis claim the ICBM is the largest missile to have ever been fired from a road mobile launcher. In early 2018, Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un suspended missile tests during a period of warming ties with Washington under President Donald Trump. The self-imposed moratorium came just prior to the Singapore summit, the first ever top-level meeting between the two nations. In exchange, the U.S. later agreed to suspend provocative military drills with Seoul in what was dubbed a freeze-for-freeze agreement. However, the window for diplomacy was not open long, and the next meeting between Trump and Kim in Vietnam was a disaster. The Hanoi summit was largely tainted by last-minute demands by National Security Advisor John Bolton, which were flatly rejected by Pyongyang. In late 2019, bilateral ties devolved to the point that Kim officially rescinded the freeze on missile tests. We found no reason to be unilaterally bound any longer by the commitment that other parties failed to honor, North Korean diplomat Yoo Jong-chol said at a UN conference on disarmament in January 2020, citing hostile policies by the United States. And so, very important, this happened in January of 2020 during the Trump administration. I think the memory that Americans have of Trump is being soft on North Korea, and it's being presented in the mainstream media that Trump was soft on North Korea. North Korea took those years to develop new missiles, and now that Biden is in charge and could be hard on North Korea, they're testing all those missiles they developed under Trump. That's just simply not the case. That's not what happened here. Trump, for a brief period of time, indicated that he may be willing to drop the American demands that clearly violate North Korea's red lines. And with that, North Korea was willing to engage in diplomacy with the U.S. When it became clear that Trump was not willing to drop those demands that violate North Korea's red lines, North Korea went back to the same policy it had under Bush and Obama. Despite some progress under the Trump administration, including a historic meeting with Kim at the DMZ, those positive steps would ultimately be undone. In addition to repeated demands that North Korea give up its nuclear arsenal and a refusal to lift sanctions, Trump also mined efforts by South Korean President Moon Jae-in to improve diplomacy with the North. Joe Biden's North Korea policy has differed from Trump's, more resembling President Barack Obama's. Rather than issuing threats of fire and fury, the Biden administration remains that it is prepared to meet without precondition and harbors no hostilities towards the DPRK, but nonetheless insists on denuclearization of North Korea. The de facto policy of strategic patience produced no results in the first year of the Biden presidency. Since January, North Korea has carried out a series of 10 missile and rocket tests, some of which Pyongyang claims were for satellites, not weapons. South Korea has responded with a number of missile drills of its own. While the White House has warned of an upcoming ICBM test for over a month ahead of Thursday's launch, it appears it will not alter U.S. policy. This is what Jen Psaki said. The door has not closed on diplomacy, but Pyongyang must immediately cease its destabilizing actions. The U.S. announced new sanctions against people and organizations from 5 countries accused of supporting weapons proliferation in Iran, North Korea, and Syria on Thursday. Among them was North Korean national Ri Su-chol, who was blacklisted for transferring sensitive items to the country's missile programs, as well as Pyongyang's Second Academy of Natural Science Foreign Affairs Bureau. A Russian citizen and 2 Russian entities were also sanctioned for their links to Pyongyang's missile program, with the Treasury Department declaring they highlight the negative role Moscow plays on the world stage. One last story on North Korea here, and I just want to mention that the Korean election was held and a new president from the Conservative Party was elected. And I will have more on that as I learn more about this guy. And I'm just trying to get a little bit of handle on Korean politics before I weigh in too much. It seems like bad news, but I maybe that's mostly just because, as I think it's been pretty clear on this show, I thought that Moon Jae-in did present a real chance for diplomacy. That's the current South Korean president, and he was from the more liberal party, so the conservative being elected would make me think that it's going to move in the opposite direction. Now, before I wrap up here, I have a few stories on China that I want to discuss. The U.S. issued new sanctions on China, and this came about the same time the U.S. Biden was meeting with Chinese leader Jinping, and during that meeting, Biden issued various threats about Beijing's ties with Moscow, right? And so we had that, and then we got these sanctions. Me and Will write this at the Libertarian Institute. Washington has imposed new sanctions on Chinese officials in response to repressive acts against ethnic and religious minorities. The move comes just days after the Biden administration threatened penalties over China's continued relationship with Russia. The State Department announced the sanctions on Monday. That's last Monday, almost a week from today. Imposing visa restrictions on unspecified officials while accusing them of a range of abuses against members of ethnic minority groups, dissidents, human rights defenders, journalists, labor organizations, civil society organizers, and peaceful protesters. While the department made no mention of Russia, the penalties followed a recent statement from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and President Biden himself that the U.S. would respond to Beijing's ongoing support for Moscow despite the invasion of Ukraine. Last week, Sullivan met with Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi in Rome, where he reportedly threatened isolation and sanctions over China's ties with Russia. The sit-down lasted several hours and was described as intense by an observer. Biden also spoke with Chinese President Xi last Friday and outlined implications and consequences should Beijing provide material support to Russia as it continues brutal attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilians, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said. According to a readout obtained by Chinese media, however, Xi was unmoved by the threat, invoking a favored saying, let he who has tied the bell on the tiger's net take it off. The Chinese president instead urged Washington and NATO to resolve the Ukraine crisis themselves and address Russia's security concerns. So that kind of ties in with the Russia story, but just wanted to mention that there were new sanctions on China, although the U.S. continues to use like the Uyghur issue as its main source for that. Now, a couple other stories on China I want to mention, since I really talked about the U.S.-China relationship on the show last, was just before the invasion of Ukraine, our State Department head, Secretary of State, America's top diplomat, was in the Solomon Islands trying to get them to allow America to open up an embassy. And if you'll actually remember the show before that, I had pointed out that one of the reasons I thought that the U.S. may not be that concerned about an invasion of Ukraine was that rather than trying to negotiate and prevent that invasion, our Secretary of State was out in the Solomon Islands trying to open an embassy. It just, seemingly in the level of importance between those two things, the embassy would surely come much, much lower than presenting the war. And so that's kind of the U.S. take on world policy and just how much of a mess our foreign policy is at this time. Now, there are reports out this week from the Financial Times that they have obtained a draft of a elite draft of an agreement between the government of the Solomon Islands and China that would establish a military relationship between the two countries. I mean, if China wants to do that, then the U.S. shouldn't maybe, particularly intervene or anything like that, at least not militarily. I'm not saying that it's a great development in the world stage, but at the same time, it's certainly not something that the U.S. needs to interfere with. China has also announced sanctions on Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and at one point I would kind of just think it was silly when other countries would sanction American companies. However, sanctions on Lockheed Martin or Raytheon could have some impacts in those countries trying to obtain various things they need from the Chinese supply chain. Let's see. There are some increasing ties between Australia and the United States related to both countries' space programs. Like the United States, Australia is opening up a space command, and those two space commands are going to have discussions and things like that. The U.S. also held a Quad meeting in Australia. That the Quad is the U.S.'s attempt at forming an alliance between India, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific. And that conference was about cybersecurity. I really don't have any other details at this time. And then the Philippines are going to receive upgraded TOW missiles and targeting equipment from the United States. And before I wrap up here, I have one last story from myself and Will Porter on this situation. The Taiwanese carried out war games pretty close to China, and I think this is important. Taiwan holds war games miles off China's coast. This is from myself and Will Porter, March 17th. Taiwan has carried out live fire military drills just miles away from China's mainland as the island remains on high alert following Russia's attack on Ukraine. The US and Japan matched Taipei with their own exercises near Mount Fuji this week, also focused on Beijing. The drills were held Wednesday on the Dongjin Island, Taiwan's northern territory located just 30 miles off of the mainland, with troops firing artillery shells and machine gun targets in the ocean. The exercises aim to prepare soldiers to repel an amphibious assault by Chinese forces, with Taipei recently voicing concerns that Beijing will attempt to seize one of its smaller islands as the world is focused on fighting in Ukraine. And I'd like to point out that Ted Galen Carpenter has been warning about this for several months. And I don't think if it happens, it would be at all really related to Ukraine. It would be more just a move because the U.S. is increasing its military ties with Taipei so much. This is the kind of move that, if China really wanted to go for it, probably couldn't in any meaningful way be repelled by the Taiwanese military. And like more of it's a show of force. It is conquering territory and things like that. But if you look at the map here, this island is clearly closer to China than it is Taiwan. And so the fact that this island remains outside Beijing's control is almost a testament to how weak Beijing is. And any threat to invade it really wouldn't be a sign of that much strength. While Taiwan raised its alert level just before Russia invaded its Ukraine, Beijing insisted it has no plans for a similar attack, arguing that the island is not Ukraine while rejecting air in comparison. China considers Taiwan part of its sovereign territory, though it has long been self-governed and firmly refers to itself as the Republic of China. However, as noted by foreign policy commentator Ted Galen Carpenter, China is growing impatient with Taipei's increasingly blunt rejection of unification with the mainland and continues ties with the United States, stepping up its own military presence near the island with several naval exercises in recent months, including some alongside Russian forces. Also worth noting, around the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, China sent 9 aircraft into Taiwan's ADIZ. That's the Air Defense Identification Zone. Definitely not the same as Taiwanese airspace. This is out in between the Philippines and Taiwan that these maneuvers took place, but nonetheless is somewhat provocative. Those moves come as U.S. and local allies carry out regular war games and show of force in the region. On Thursday, the American and Japanese militaries kicked off 3 weeks of joint airborne combat drills near Mount Fuji, with 400 Japanese soldiers joining 600 U.S. Marines on the island of Okinawa. We are committed to securing the peace and stability in the region, though U.S. and Japan joint operation responses. Any potential adversary will see that this is our actual capacity, not just words, said Colonel Mashihi Haraki, who leads Japan's first amphibious rapid deployment region. The Joe Biden administration is spending billions to build up its military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific and has identified China as America's top competitor in the coming decades. In addition to constant drills and nearly months transit in the nearly monthly transits in the Taiwan Strait by U.S. warships, Biden continues to proclaim that the United States has a duty to come to the island's defense in the event of an attack from the mainland, despite contradictory statements from other White House officials that the U.S. policy of strategic ubiquity remains unchanged. And so that's there are some similarities I think between Ukraine and Taiwan, especially the way the US treats those two countries, although I don't see a similar situation with an invasion unfolding anytime soon. Now, look at the Biden administration starts to say like we definitely will go to war for China, and we're going to treat Taiwan as an ally or something like that. That could provoke China, just like Russia was provoked in Ukraine. But these two situations are very different, and 80 to 100 mile stretch of water is far different than being the bordering state when it comes to military maneuvers. So that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you everybody for listening. Just remind y'all, if you're still listening, you probably really like this show. And if you'd like to support it, like to see it to continue long into the future, head on over to thelibertarian.org/donate and support our institute today. Thanks everyone.